And one question that came up that I feel like is just so foundational is defining what we mean by joy and how we find that not only in the scriptural definitional way, but also the practical ways of rooting into that. So let's open our discussion from there.
All right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I would say something that I think is not a very popular, common opinion. I think it should be, though. Here's the thing that I often hear people say. They say, there's a difference between happiness and joy. Happiness is shallow. It's based on circumstances. And but joy is like this deep-rooted thing. Like you can be miserable, but also joyful at the same time. And actually, I think linguistically, that's just not actually true. I think happiness is a really important word. And I think that we as Christians should try to redeem that word and claim it. And you know why? Is because there are a lot of reasons, but in Greek there's this word for happiness, which is the word makarios, and Jesus uses that word in the Sermon on the Mount. So if you read the Sermon on the Mount in Greek, right, what he's saying there is he's saying not, oh, how blessed are the poor in spirit, but if you read it literally in Greek, he's saying, oh, how happy are the poor in spirit. And I have to say that, it gives it a different tone, doesn't it? I mean, because, you could say, how are you? Oh, I'm blessed, brother. That's different than saying, I am deeply happy. And I don't know about you, but I want to be happy. Have you guys ever noticed that, when a baby cries, everybody's like, well, yeah, sure, that's what babies do. They cry because they can't talk, right? That's how they communicate. But when a baby smiles, everybody gets their phone out. And it's like an event, right? Everybody stops what they're doing. Hang on, there's a baby smiling over here. There's a baby laughing. And why is that? Because, listen, we were created for joy. And I don't think that we have to draw a line between joy and happiness. What we should do is just define our terms. There is a type of happiness that is shallow, that's rooted in just circumstances, that comes and goes. It's like a mood, right? You ate something wrong, you didn't sleep last night, so you're not happy. Yeah, but there's also a deep-rooted happiness that goes beyond circumstances, like Jesus talked about. Think about what he says. Oh, how happy are you who weep. That's a weird thing to say, unless it's true, right? In other words, there's a kind of happiness you can have even when you're weeping. Oh, how happy are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake, when people say all kinds of nasty things about you. That's literally in the Sermon on the Mount. So, I mentioned I lived in Hungary. I speak Hungarian fluently. And in Hungarian, one thing that I love about it is that in Hungarian, they don't translate that word as blessed. They have a word that's blessed, for blessed. But when you read the Sermon on the Mount in Hungarian, it just uses the normal word for happy. Oh, how happy are you who are poor in spirit. Which is a radical thing to say. And it forces you to say, how is that possible? And then you have to dig in and find out. But it's a word, by the way, and you say, well, Jesus didn't speak in Greek. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, or maybe in Hebrew. And actually, we have that word in the Old Testament, and we know what the word is in Aramaic. And it's the word ashrei, which means happy. And that word is found in the Old Testament. Remember the passages in the Psalms? Happy are the people, or in English we say, blessed are the people whose God is the Lord. Well, the original says ashrei, which means happy. Happy are the people whose God is the Lord. Again, it's a different vibe. It's a different tone that I think we have to reclaim and recover. There's nothing bad about happiness. Happiness is a great thing. We just have to determine what our happiness is based in. So that's my rant on happiness. I've been thinking about it for a long time, so thanks for letting me talk about it.
That's pretty good. I would say that we really have to, as you were saying, redefine and put where our happiness comes from, our joy comes from. It's supposed to be something that's so deep rooted. It's supposed to be core to ourselves, that it's the joy of the Lord. And so our happiness and our joy is based off of the Lord. And so it's it should be so foundational to us that it bubbles up into us and it affects our circumstances. Instead of the other way around, like our circumstances affecting our joy, it should be that it comes from the Lord. And so therefore, it should bubble up and overflow into our circumstances and change the way we see things, change the way that we act and receive things. That, it's oftentimes the culture tells us that, why are you happy? Look at everything that's going around. It's horrible and the world is falling apart. Well, yes, but my joy comes from the Lord, and that comes out of me and goes into my circumstances and affects things around me for the good, for the Lord. And so I just think it's just a backwards way of looking at it that the world has. So.
Yeah, I mean, what we don't want to say is that you always have to pretend. I don't think you should pretend. I don't think that you should, basically, look, it's a happiness that comes from, or a joy that comes from the hope that you have, and no one can take that away from you. And so Christians are the most optimistic people in the world because of our eschatology. And I don't just mean, when I say eschatology, I don't just mean our timeline for end-time events. I mean the fact that we are an eschatological people. We are moving towards the great consummation of all things and the hope of eternal life.
Yeah, I think this actually has an interesting connection with the whole context of John 17 and this contrast between the world and being of God. So what ways do you think the culture has influenced the way we think about happiness, that there would be a resistance in Christian circles to use that translation of happy rather than the more theologically charged blessed?
Yeah, well, I was waiting for you to kind of say something awesome, and then I, say like 2 words. So, but yeah, I do think that the culture tells us the idea that, they feed us the idea that our happiness is based off of our circumstances, which, in a sort of a way it is, because it would be, strange to say that our circumstances don't affect us. If my wife would pass away, that would affect my happiness. But, so there's certain levels of that. But I think the culture just doesn't understand the deep-rooted nature of having your joy in the Lord based off of the promises, based off of salvation. So,
if you go back to antiquity, right, so the time of the Greeks particularly, Greek philosophers, they were obsessed with trying to define this thing that they called the good life, right? And so, they were all trying to figure out how to have the good life. If you go to different types of philosophy, like Stoicism and, Platonism and things like this, they're all different takes on how to have the good life. What is the good life and how do you get it? And you can say the same thing is true in our world today, right? So in a materialistic society, which is what we live in, every commercial you watch is generally about how to have a good life. You need this type of shampoo so that you can have a good life, right?
I'm offended by that.
Yeah, I know. So, do you get what I'm saying? Everything is on this trajectory because people want this, right? There's something, like I said, we were made for joy and we desire to have it and we're looking for it. Oftentimes in the wrong places, and that's what we do wrong, right? We look for joy in the wrong places and it leads to sorrow rather than joy or lack of fulfillment. But, essentially the Sermon on the Mount, what's so profound about it is that Jesus is coming, particularly in the Beatitudes, he's giving this thing that is so radically different, and he's describing the good life. So when he says blessed, right, or happy, makarios, that's the same kind of thinking that somebody would put into a concept of the good life. And so Jesus is saying, do you want to know how to truly have a good life? And then he says these things that are absolutely backwards of everything that anybody thinks. People would say, in order to have a good life, well, you've got to have a smile on your face. And Jesus says, no, happy are you who weep, right? And happy are you who are poor in spirit. Happy are you who are meek. And essentially what Jesus is saying is this: with his coming into the world, something has now happened which changes everything and flips everything on its head. And this is now the way to have true happiness. And I think that we have to just root ourselves so deeply in the gospel that we understand that there are competing narratives in the world. They're always competing, telling you this is how to have a good life. And we have to stand against that and say, no, that's not going to fulfill. It's going to be, it's going to be empty. It's going to be, chasing after the wind. And so we have to be rooted in the gospel.
Yeah, I find that a lot in, I think some relatives I have even, they find their happiness in the possessions that they have, the job that they have, what people view them as on Instagram or something like that. And I look at their life and, I talk to them and I have to think, man, it's kind of a sad existence. There's really nothing to it other than what people view you as makes you happy. And if people view you as successful, then they're happy. It's kind of a shallow existence.
Yeah, and I had something to say, I forgot. Yeah,
I'm sure it was significant. But
this is a really interesting question somebody asked. They say, do you think that the lack of joy in modern Christianity is linked to the lack of evangelism?
Yeah.
Yes. I think that, if we had that passionate joy that we want, that would overflow from us, that we want others to experience what I'm experiencing, then we would desperately want them to have it. I want you to experience what I have. And, and I also don't want you to experience what's coming for you. So, there's that mixture. But that passion that you have, that sheer joy, that if we truly had that joy, we would want people, if we loved them enough, we would want them to have the joy we have.
Yeah, well, here's the other part. It's reciprocal. Okay, so as you share your faith, what happens? You have to think about it. You have to think about the hope that you have so you can explain it to somebody else. And as you do that, it's reciprocal in the sense of yes, you're sharing it, but also it's causing you to be reminded of the hope and the joy that you have, and it causes it to stir up. And then when it's time to worship, right, you are reminded because you just talked about it yourself. You hear those words coming out of your mouth. You're encouraged, and it reminds you of what you have to worship for. And absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I think that you just reminded me of sharing your story. Share your testimony. Understand your testimony and how God has worked in your life gives you that joy. It shows you, it reminds you of the joy. And so that, I always encourage men in our church, know your testimony, see how God has worked in your life, and be ready to share it. And that reminds you of the joy, it reminds you of the good things that the Lord has done in your life. And it really helps you want to share that.
It almost seems like there's something countercultural to Christianity right now, right? Because the person who wants you to go on mission with them gets up there and they kind of guilt you into it, and they want you to know how hard the ministry is, and you just have this kind of guilt trip. But spurring them on to joy is almost an opposite response, I think, of what we're seeing in some of those things. So how would you cultivate this within your congregation to, you see a deficiency in evangelism, and how do you cultivate that joy that doesn't feel disconnected from the mission?
Yeah, one thing I've really been telling our staff a lot lately is a phrase that I heard from somebody else, and it's this, that ministry is modeling at its core, right? And so, if you look at Jesus, he never tells us to do something that he doesn't do himself, right? He doesn't say, be generous, and yet he's stingy. He doesn't say, take up your cross and not take up his own cross, right? You can go down the line. And I think that that's super important in ministry. How do you model? How do you do it in church? It begins with modeling. You can't ask anyone to do anything that you're not doing yourself. And you model for them the joy of the gospel, right? That this is, at the root, we're not being motivated by guilt. We're not being motivated by fear. But we're being motivated by joy. And I think that short-term motivating people with joy is less effective than motivating them with fear. But long term, it's the only thing that's sustainable. Because fear is kind of like a shot of adrenaline. It comes in for a moment and it might make you do something, but it doesn't last. It quickly passes. And guilt and fear, they're things that people essentially get over, but I don't think you get over joy. I think that joy has a lasting longevity to it that any other motivation doesn't have.
Yeah, we are, for those who don't know, we pastor at the same church. He's the lead pastor, I'm the executive pastor. And so when we're talking about our staff, we're talking about, us as well. And so one thing that we try and focus on is the top down. If we are not doing it, if we are not, as Nick said, modeling it and teaching it and to our ministry leaders, then, and we expect them to model that and teach that to the people in their ministry teams, and then it goes on down the line. It's really important to do that, because if we're not doing that, if we're not modeling it, if we're not discipling the people that God has put in our lives to do that, then it's just going to stop with us. We need to tell people and show them and teach them how to do it. And then those people will model it and teach and disciple those that are under them. And it goes down through everybody in the church, and it filters out. And so, but it starts with the leadership. If we're not doing it, then how can we possibly expect anybody else to do it?
Yeah, and then, we also say a lot of other kind of like mantras. Like one of the things that we talk about a lot is culture, right? Culture is the way things are done around here, wherever here is. Another thing about culture is that people replicate what you celebrate. In other words, if you celebrate certain things, people will do those things more. So make sure you celebrate the right things and not the wrong things. And create the kind of culture that you want to see. Culture is created in two ways. One way is by doing things, but the other way is by allowing things. So what do you allow and what do you not allow? What things do you model and what things do you not model? Like where do you say, nope, sorry, that's not what we do around here? And what things do you say, no, this is what we do around here? And as you do that over time, but also model it, so it's not just like empty talk, eventually you create a culture in which that's the way that people think. It's the only way they know. And I was talking to, I think it was David a minute ago, just saying like, I was, I received a type of culture, enculturation through my pastor, right? There were the things that he did. And now what's funny, I find myself doing a lot of those same things without even thinking about it. And so that's what we want to do in ministry, is that we're like plowing a trench, if you will. And we plow it over and over and over and over again until it gets deep. And that's how it is with creating a culture of joy and motivation of evangelism. So, a culture of evangelism, motivation, joy.
I think along that lines is, with the joy and the fear, it's the positive reinforcement. It's the celebration that what they're doing is right, instead of admonishing, oh, you're not doing this right. When it happens, we celebrate it, and we're excited. It's like the joy, there's joy there, instead of, you're not doing it right. There's that positive reinforcement. Sometimes it has to be,
and another part of it is the stories that you tell, right?
Yeah.
Which stories get told? Do you tell the stories of the people who are doing this thing that you want to see replicated? Tell those stories. Make them part of the lore, the legend, right? This place has lore and legend. The Calvary Chapel movement has lore and legend. Your church might have it, and you create that as a leader, right? There are stories that you intentionally tell over and over and over again because you're creating a narrative, because the narrative then shapes the people.
I have an interesting example of that kind of culture shift. I was working at a church, and the pastoral staff there used this phrase, welcome to ministry, but only when bad things happened. Only when the people complained about the worship music being too loud and all this type of stuff. And it was easy to fit into the culture. You're like, I'm on the inside, I can say welcome to ministry. But then we were doing a mission. We were in Costa Rica, and we were doing some evangelism, and totally unexpected, we got invited over to a family's house. way overcrowded, tiny little place, but they invited us in. We shared the gospel with them. We had a worship thing. It was amazing. And I just had this desire to say, welcome to ministry. Like, this is ministry. And the pastors there were completely shocked, and they said, why did you say that? Because it's true. Like, this is the ministry that I think the Lord is calling us to and leading us in. And it was a culture shift, and it was very uncomfortable in the moment. But that was the joy that was like, yeah, ministry is about joy. And even that verse in Nehemiah, the joy of the Lord is our strength. It seems like it's the antidote to the fear motivation. It's like, well, it doesn't matter what's coming my way if I have this joy rooted in the Lord. It's like, well, what other motivation could dissuade me from this motivation to be on mission always?
Yeah, I love that story. That's so good, man. That's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, and I think that. Well, again, I forgot what I was going to say. So go ahead. Yeah, there's something about that, but I think what you said was fine.
Well, you had all the speaking to do, and have more to come, so it's fine. I think this kind of gives opportunity for you guys to share some similar types of things. We had several questions of examples in your life of facing difficult circumstances, but fostering joy during those times.
I remember those things. And it ties into what you're saying. So, okay, yeah, you know what I was thinking about as I was saying about this? I think that the desire for joy and happiness actually motivates people to do hard things, right? So, like, if you think about it, like, people do all kinds of hard things. People run marathons and climb mountains that cause themselves a lot of pain. But why do they do it? It's because there's a joy that comes through it that they want to have. I mean, that's at the end of everything, right? Like, parents, they'll teach their kids to have good manners. Why? Because they really believe that if they do that, their kids will have a more joyful experience in life. And I think that actually happiness and joy is what motivates most people to do the things that they do. And I think that framing Christianity around that point, which I think is biblical, like we see in John 17, that the telos, the purpose of it is joy. I think that changes the whole vibe. So, yeah. Even hard things, though, right? Like, sometimes we do things in ministry that aren't fun. And, but why do we do them? Well, it's actually for joy. I mean, that's what this is about Jesus. He went to the cross for joy, right? So, yeah. So, what was your question again?
Just an example in your life, or in ministry or on mission, a difficult circumstance that you were able to have joy through.
Yeah. Man, I've been through so many difficult things in ministry. Let me think. We went through some really hard stuff this past year in our church. We had to remove 3 people from our church, which is like, we hadn't done that in a really long time. Remove people from our church, and we had to do it 3 times. And one of them was a leader in our church, and that was really hard. And it did not go as well as we had hoped. Right? Like, I think that we did the right thing, but this person did not receive it well. And that was really hard. He was a personal friend of mine. We used to run together, and, I hung out with him. He was a friend. And so one of the things I've noticed in ministry is that sometimes, over the years, sometimes you lose some friends, and that's really hard. And yet, again, why am I doing this? Like, why would I lose friends on purpose? And the reason is because there's a joy that comes with doing the right thing before the Lord. There's a joy that comes with protecting other people. And there's a settledness, right? Like, I can go to bed at night knowing that before God, I did the right thing, even though I might have lost a friend, right? And so, yeah, I think that would be the example that comes to mind right now.
Yeah, and I would say that definitely when we were going through those moments and we'd come out of these very difficult meetings, that you'd walk out of it and you're just exhausted and, you feel like your joys are just sapped out of you. There are people that we surround ourselves with that have the joy of the Lord, and they have the vision of the church, and they can pour into our lives again. It's like we've emptied our cup in that meeting, and as soon as we come out of that meeting, there were people filling our cup back up again, and exhorting the great, hey, look what you're doing. You're doing a good job. You're protecting the church, and pouring the Lord back into us, and so that we felt energized again and joyful, even after these meetings that were just, they weren't happy-making meetings. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk more tomorrow about, I had an accident last April that kind of changed my life, and that was really hard, but realizing that in the midst of it, I think that what we have as Christians is that we have this narrative that we live in, right? This, as I said, eschatological, not in the sense of a timeline of the end times events, but in the big picture, right? That Christianity is moving, it's all moving towards something, which is redemption in Jesus. We know how this is going to play out. We know that the Lord is with us. We have these promises from the Bible. And having those things, and those things maybe like you learn at one point, what happens is that when you do face difficult things, those promises in a way are like activated, right? Those things that were maybe like, okay, I knew it, but now I get to live it, right? Now I need it. Now I need to put it into practice. I just think that we're like equipped for it, as Christians. We're being equipped all the time to face everything that life has to throw at us and understand the big picture and understand where it's all going and how God can use it. And like I said, optimistic. Our eschatology is optimistic. The best is yet to come. And what that also means is that even in this life, I know that God isn't going to just waste the difficult times in my life. He'll use them, and He'll be with me through them. And I think just that knowing those things is what equips you to have joy in the midst of hardship.
Yeah, just add one more thing. I think that it's also God, like you're saying, God is equipping us during those difficult times so that when we're out of those difficult times, we could share that joy with others. He's equipping us to be able to share that so that others can find joy in their difficulties. Because we look back. It's hard to find joy when you're going through it. You go through it and you're like, there's no joy. But afterwards you can look back and go, wow, look what God is doing. Look at how He grew me through that. And that brings me joy. And then when somebody else is going through it, you can share that.
Yeah, one of the best pieces of advice I got when I went through my accident is that a friend of mine, Mike Maglia, he's leading the Expositors Collective, and Mike got hit by a car a couple of years ago when he was running, and almost died. I mean, he was in really bad shape. And so when I got hurt, we talk a lot, but he reached out to me specifically, and he said, here's what I wish somebody would have told me back then. He said, I was so focused, like, when I got hurt, like, I need to figure out what God's doing through this. I need to be able to, like, give a testimony. And then, like, he's still in the hospital and stuff. And he goes, bro, listen, this is, one day you're going to look back and you're going to have a testimony. And you're going to be able to say, this is what God did. And this is what I learned through it. But don't put that pressure on yourself in the midst of it. Just, like, go through it. And just understand, it's a bad thing that you have to go through. And just let it be bad. And I think that's one of the things I love about Christianity is that it has the integrity to say that bad things are actually bad. If you look at other philosophical systems, what they'll often try to do is they'll try to say, well, every cloud has a silver lining, and if you just look at it from the right angle, then you'll see that bad thing is actually a good thing. Or they'll try to dismiss it in some other way. But Christianity has the intellectual integrity to look bad things in the face and say, no, that's actually bad. It's so bad that God Himself had to come and die in order to deal with the badness in this world. And I think that is so refreshing, right? To just look at some things in the world and say, there is absolutely no redeeming value in this thing. It just is literally bad. But there's a God who brings good out of bad. He doesn't make those bad things good. He brings good things out of the bad. That's amazing. But I think it's also intellectually it has integrity, you know? Because, you can look at somebody and say, well, if you look at it from the right perspective, it's actually maybe a good thing. No, Christianity says, no, just objectively bad. And I like that. So I hope that you understand that when we talk about joy and happiness, we're not saying, turn your frown upside down in every situation, but we are saying that something has now happened that changes everything. And even the truly bad things in the world, God is going to do something and has done something that will ultimately result in something that changes everything for history and for you.
There's something so here, now, and active about that. I think it's a myth that our testimony is written, but rather that it's being written. And I've fallen into this and even thought like, I had a revisionist sense of my own story, because I'll pretend that I had faith through something on the other side of it, but not in the middle of it. I'm just changing my testimony to preach the best way. And I think it's because I think my testimony is done. This was just an unexpected addition to it, rather than, no, my testimony is actively being written. It's not done until I am, And those verses, like in Romans, talking about God working things out. He's working, actively doing that in our life. And in context of our conversation of cultivating joy, it's like, well, there it is. It's an active thing that God is doing. It's not just, I found the answer to it. Here's your joy, just hold on to this. It's, here's your joy, and this is going to have so many multivariate expressions within your life. And it's going to fit every season and circumstance.
I heard somebody say this once, and I think it's really true. So here's what he said. He said, like, for example, if you look at things in the moment, in the granular, like in the details, they're oftentimes not very beautiful, but then when you zoom out, they're incredibly beautiful. So like he used this example, he said, like think about like a family, right? Like in the family, maybe they got I have teenagers at home. And sometimes that's hard, right? Like so one of them's yelling at somebody else, and people are upset, and like there's all this chaos and quarreling in the home. And you look at that and you say, that's not very beautiful. If you zoom out and you look at the big picture of it, right? That every day we're as a family together, working through these things, loving each other, growing, pursuing the Lord. That's really beautiful. And I think back, some of the hardest times I had in ministry was when I lived in Hungary. And there were times when I developed autoimmune problems because I was so stressed out. And, many times so discouraged, so disappointed. And yet now I look back at that time as one of the most beautiful and wonderful times of my life. It's like, when I was going through it, I was so stressed out that I wanted to die. And now I look back and I'm like, man, those are the good old days. And I think that's how it works. It's like when you're in it, but then you realize, like when you get out from it, that actually, no, God was using that. God was doing things beyond what I could see in the moment. But I think that is inherent to Christianity. That Christianity encourages us to have this big picture view of our lives where we don't get caught up in the difficulty of the moment, or in the moment we can't say, this is bad. But then we also are able to zoom out with the eyes of faith and Scripture, right, and say, but I'm part of this big story of what God is doing. And in the end, I can have hope, and I can even have a joyful perspective on all of it, even though in the moment this is really, really hard.
I agree with that. I think that the idea that focusing on ourselves too much, we're not the main character of the story. Jesus is the main character of the story. We're a supporting cast. And so we keep needing to make Jesus that main character of the story. So to zoom out and say, this is an arc of how God has worked. And it just so happens that I have a front row seat in how he does it in my life. But it's really, he's working so much in our church. There's these great stories that are going on, many of which we don't even know about. But he's the main character of the story. And I'm just happy that I'm written into the story. So it's much, take a step back and look at the big story of what God is doing.
I heard from a missionary once that the majority of people who leave the mission field leave because of internal conflict, not external conflict, meaning conflict on the missions team, not the difficulty of the circumstances of the mission field. Just curious on your thoughts on that, and what are potential ways of combating this?
Yeah, I mean, I was on mission teams, and I would say, yeah, it's intense. It's intense because you're so close to each other. And so you see each other's flaws, and yeah, I made mistakes for sure in leading, and I grew through them. I'm thankful for God's grace and getting us through that and helping us grow. But one of the things that I've kind of told myself is that big picture thing. It's like, I don't want to do anything that I'm going to later like really regret, you know? And so I think that even having that big picture where you're able to zoom out, I'm like, is this good? You know, remembering the humanity of the other people on the team, I think is super important. So anyway, I try to do that with our staff as well now. I think that that's probably the strength of our church, is that we have very healthy staff and leadership culture. And so that comes from being part of dysfunctional teams. I think a lot of the most important lessons I learned were lessons I learned from watching people do things and saying to myself, I will never do that if I'm ever in charge. And, you know, those negative impacts leave a deeper memory, you know, than positive ones tend to. You know, another thing I've heard that's related to that is I've heard that some people say, well, when a lot of people say that they're burned out, the truth is that they're actually discouraged. Now, sometimes they are burned out, right? Like, but oftentimes it's that they're discouraged. I worked with this guy, he was on my team in Hungary, and he kept telling me how he was burned out. And so I kept taking stuff off of his plate until he actually had nothing to do, and he still told me he was burned out. And I was like, you know what, I think actually you're discouraged, and discouragement is a killer in ministry, because I think we all desire to see more, you know, fruit and more results and things like that. And so, again, it's that long game. When you think about, you're talking about fruit up and roots down. Gardening metaphors, when you plant a seed, for the first big part of it, something is happening, but you can't see it. And I think that takes a lot of faith. It takes faith to know that something's happening, even if I can't see it. But yeah, I don't know, Jason, what do you think about thermodynamics?
Yeah, I don't have much experience in, you know, the sexy international missions team. I'm more of a domestic cat, I guess. But just kind of hang out, you know, do the work of the ministry at home. But for me, I've experienced burnout, but it was frustration, because I was a part of a miserable team at one point, and I was just like, I don't even want to be here anymore. And so I always encourage we have to minister to the team, people in the team. Everybody has to minister to each other even if you're ministering to the person above you, because you want them to keep pushing forward for the gospel and minister to the people that God has placed under you and even next to you. Be ministering, because, you know, the enemy wants that person to be separated, not ministered to. And once the enemy gets a hold of somebody and really, you know, makes them burned out, makes them frustrated, it's going to, more often than not, spread. You know, you put like a nice clean glove on and you stick it in mud, you know, the glove is going to get muddy, the mud's not going to get glovey. You know, it's easier for the bad to just kind of seep through. And so we want to constantly be ministering to people, constantly be, you know, they're not just a position, they are people, and we want to minister to them and let them be a conduit for the Holy Spirit in our church.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of my lessons that I've learned have been through things I've seen done bad and wanted to not be done bad. So like one of the things I always say internally is like I always say, I want working in our church to be the best experience of somebody's life, because I've heard of people who've been like, you know, working in a church. I love Jesus until I worked at that church. I'm like, man, that should be the opposite, right? So how do we create that? It says in Ephesians chapter 4, it says, strive to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Striving means working really hard. And what that means is that, you know, we even use this in Calvary Chapel. We use, you know, Chuck Smith famously said, the man of God shall not strive. In other words, you don't need to try and force things all the time. But there is one area where you do need to strive. That's in Ephesians 4. It says, strive to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Put a lot of work into it, you know? And don't use people. You know, view part of your ministry as ministering to the people you serve alongside with.
I find that verse kind of crazy that it talks about the unity of the Spirit, which unfortunately the Spirit becomes one of the most disunifying parts that we argue about. Are His gifts for today? What about this? How do we foster the fruit? We're people of the Spirit or not. And we know as Calvary Chapel, some people say we're too charismatic, other people say we're not charismatic enough, which means we're probably at a good balance when we're complained about by both sides. But the Spirit by nature is the most unifying thing that we have as believers, that He would dwell inside of us and create a unity that would transcend anything human. So what are your thoughts on the place of the Spirit in creating that unity, or the place of the Spirit in fostering this heart for missions and all these different things we're talking about? What's the role of the Spirit in all of this?
Yeah. I think what you said is really important, right? The Spirit is in us, and the Spirit is leading us, reminding us of what Jesus said. And, I just spoke to a guy recently who wrote a systematic theology on the topic of the Holy Spirit. And he said, what's really hard is that if you go through the text of the Scriptures, if you really try to find all the verses about the Holy Spirit, you can. But the problem is that the Spirit, he says the Spirit is deflective. And what that means is that whenever you start focusing on the Spirit, all of a sudden you find the Spirit is pointing you towards the Son, towards the Father. And he said, I think that's how you're knowing that the Spirit is really at work. Is that He's pointing you towards Jesus, and He's pointing you back to the will of the Father. He's deflective. In other words, He doesn't take the attention on Himself. So, I think that's part of it, is that if you're really walking in the Spirit, it's going to be pointing you away from focusing on the Spirit, first of all, but also pointing you towards what Jesus said in the mission that He gave. And I think, oftentimes when I've seen, like at church, let's say that church gets dysfunctional, I think that is directly related to disengagement from the mission. Because if we're really pushing for something, we need everybody to be on board. We need to lock shields. And any kind of weird disagreements or idiosyncrasies, it becomes secondary. And we're kind of like, that doesn't matter because we've got this other thing that we're trying to do, and we can all unify around this. But when you get off of mission, that's, I think, when you get into division. So division is a direct result in many cases, maybe not all, but in many cases of getting off mission.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I've seen it where that happens, where people, they stop focusing on the high calling and start focusing on the details of how I want mission to be done. This is how I want it to be done, and I'm upset that you're not doing it the way I want it to be done. Instead of focusing on the mission. And it really starts, to pull people apart. And, unity, and that's one thing I appreciate about our staff. We're united behind the mission. We're always focusing on the mission. And Nick's always telling us, hey, we're about the gospel, we're about grace. These are the things that we're about. And so everybody needs to get on board.
I loved the way you introed your session, that whole setup of what it looks like with the disciples and their attitude. And that's kind of Peter's rebuke, right? You're off mission. This is the whole point of what I came here to do, and you should know that. And surprisingly, all of these well-studied people who are a part of his group, some of them more well-studied than others, had read their scripture and still didn't understand it. And it wasn't until they saw the resurrected Messiah that everything made sense. And we have the advantage as believers today of we kind of get that news right away, so we can read the whole Bible in light of the Messiah, which is kind of huge. But I also know that creating sympathy with the people experiencing that in that day, what was it like to be in Peter's sandals, I guess we could say, it can be kind of hard to foster that because we have this insight as new covenant believers. And I think that's interesting too when we do missions cross-culturally. A culture that isn't deeply steeped in Judeo-Christian values and things like that. And you did, ministry in Hungary for 10 years. So what would you say some of the big cultural differences are to doing ministry in the States versus ministry there? And how has that maybe changed your perspective on approaching ministry in general?
Culturally, there's a ton of differences. Still, they are a country that is still shaped by Christianity in many ways, right? But I'll tell you this, that there's a real benefit to serving in a different culture, because the thing is that you innately approach it as, this is a different culture, and therefore I need to contextualize, and I need to understand these people. I need to understand the idols that they are tempted towards, and I need to understand how the gospel relates to them individually. I think that what happens is if you never have that experience, you don't, you can think that you're in a situation where, you don't have to do that. You don't have to think deeply about how to bring the gospel to bear on these people at this time. Because it's the water you swim in, right? You're not aware of, you ask a fish, how's the water? What water, right? What's water? And I think that if you never get out of that setting, you never realize, the things that have impacted you and the way that you think, and the things that are cultural versus the things that are actually about the gospel. And so what being in Hungary helped me with is that I came back to the United States as a very changed person, doing ministry very differently, viewing my city in a very different way. Because the thing is that having been in Hungary as long as I basically spent my entire adult life there until I moved back to the United States. And I came back to the U.S. no longer the person that I left, and no longer truly American. I had, you end up as an outsider in both ways, right? Like, I'm not truly Hungarian, and I'm no longer truly American. But you realize, okay, what am I? Well, I do have a kingdom that I'm a part of, and I have a place where I belong. And I think just having that sense of like, okay, I'm a person here on a mission. I belong to a kingdom that's not of this world, that follows a different culture, that's not native to Hungary, nor is it native to the United States. And I get to bring in this good news of the kingdom to this place. But yeah, some things are different in Hungary. One thing that's really different is that they had 45 years of communism, and prior to that they had fascism. The fascism was maybe what we would call kind of like a Christian nationalism thing. It was like nationalism, but not very Christian, but kind of painted with a Christian brush. But the communism was very anti-Christian. So what we dealt with a lot was people who had never been to church in their life, like never. And or the other thing is that older people in Hungary tend to actually be communists, right? They still have communist ideals. They grew up in it. It's what they were indoctrinated in. And so, just because the regime changed didn't mean that they stopped being communists, And so what was so weird is that here, it's like older people tend to think positively about Christianity. Like, even if they don't go, they still think, that's a nice thing. I sure hope somebody does that. Or they might think like, it'd be good if somebody goes to church. But in Hungary, they do not think that way at all. Like, the older people, the ideal is to be atheists and materialistic. They even call themselves materialists, as if it's like a badge of honor. And so what that led to is that this whole generation of young people it was like almost a blank slate, almost. And you got to share the gospel with them. You got to create culture. They didn't come in with any baggage. And it led to just the funniest encounters, Like, I remember this one time, this girl came to church, somebody brought her, it was her first time ever in church in her life. So she's sitting there and she got a phone call during church. Now you guys, if you got a phone call, you'd probably just like not answer it, but she did, and she just like talking at full volume. She's like, yeah, I'm listening to this guy, he's talking about the Bible or something. And she just like went on to have a conversation. And it was just kind of refreshing, actually. I wasn't really offended. I was like, it's kind of cool. I've just never been in church before. I had this other lady who used to sit in the back of our church building, there's a window back there, and she used to just smoke through the entire service, just cigarette, chain smoke through the sermon, as the Lord is just transforming her heart. And I'm serious, and we didn't stop her. And this dude one time came in on Sunday morning. We had a couch in the back of our sanctuary near that window where the lady smoked, and he just like drank a beer. And I was like, people were like, what should we do? Should we tell him to leave? And I'm like, no, let's just let him. And he was like totally paying attention. You know, he wasn't a Christian, just drank a beer through the service. And talked to him afterwards. He joined our church actually. So anyway, that kind of stuff was really refreshing. But I remember there were other weird things. Like I remember one time this lady was like, you guys are missionaries from the United States. I know what you are. You're Methodists. And we were like, no, we're not Methodists. She's like, don't lie to me. I know that you're Methodists. And I'm not having you come in here with your cult and do this thing. And I was like, well, first of all, I don't think you know what a Methodist is. And secondly, no, I'm like really telling you the truth. I'm not a Methodist. Anyway, so we would get all kinds of weird stuff like that. But in general, I gotta tell you, the fields are ripe for the harvest. I was just in Serbia last month, and which is where Calvary Chapel in Europe started, by the way, is in Subotica in Serbia. Well, Eastern Europe at least. And I was south of Belgrade. They told me south of Belgrade there's 4 million people, and there are 9 Protestant churches. 9. And most of them are like 10 to 15 people. This one guy went to Calvary Chapel Bible College in Europe. He graduated. He's a Serbian guy. Moved back to his home country. Planted a church in a city of 200,000 people. It's the only Protestant church in the history of the city. But here's what's crazy. These people are totally open to the gospel. He has a church of 40 people, which is a miracle. It's a work of God. And I don't know, man. I'll tell you what. If I was 18 years old again, I know where I'd be. I'd be in Serbia, planting churches and preaching the gospel. So,
I have to ask, do you have a beer couch at your church now?
We have a couch. We have no, not in the sanctuary. No, we don't. Yeah, because it's not culturally acceptable.
Yeah, we'll talk about the cultural difference.
Yeah.
And then there are cultural differences, even, you know, as I said before, I'm more of a domestic individual. There are cultural differences in the United States. You know, I grew up a suburbanite, and our church is more of a suburban church. But, you know, I have gone and ministered to very rural communities. And I got to tell you, it's hard to minister to somebody. Well, we got a guy who comes and helps with the mid-conference, and we're like, how you doing? He's like, oh, I'm better than a tomato and a BLT. And you're like, what? You know, but that's completely different language. I remember going ministering to somebody that because I wanted to go to different people's houses and minister to them at home, see how they're doing, and it's hard to minister to somebody that has like a big plastic glove in his hand inside of the rear end of a cow. But there are cultural differences in the United States when you're trying to talk to people. You can experience that. For example, if I were to go down, into Compton, there'd be a lot of cultural differences that I would find out real quick. So
I always say, like, if you drove me out of an airplane in the middle of Russia, I feel totally at home. But if you took me to like the American South,
yeah.
I just no thanks. I don't know what those people are like. I don't know if I want them.
I don't even know what grits is, but I don't want it.
Yeah.
We had a question about ministering to non-believers, especially somebody who's a loved one. Seems like there's a bit of a cultural thing there, especially with our Christianese and our churchianity that kind of influences the way we talk. But do you have any specific advice for navigating that and how we do ministry without all the jargon?
Oh yeah, okay, so I have a very large extended family, and there's maybe 3 of us who are Christians, And so I think the thing is, look, just spend some time with them, man. Just like talk to them, and learn to talk to people. Spend time with people who don't think and act like you, and love them. Here's the thing, I love my cousins. And I know that they don't believe in Jesus, but I want them to. And so, I was thinking about, when you talk about people who are caught up in sin, like I have this one cousin, he's gay, right? He's married to some dude. And so when I think about how I'm going to talk about gay people in church, I think about my cousin. And I don't agree with his lifestyle. I think it's sinful, but I love him, and I want him to know the Lord. So I don't want to create barriers that are not barriers that the Bible creates. Obviously, there is a barrier that the Bible creates, but I don't want to add barriers to it by making it incomprehensible or rude. I mean, that's the thing. It's I think sometimes people congratulate themselves. They think they're being a hero for being rude. I don't think there's anything heroic about being rude. Look, speak the truth, speak it in love, be respectful, don't compromise your beliefs. Try to help people understand the goodness of the gospel. I think there's a movement right now, at least I'm aware of certain people who are you know what we need to do? We need to offend people with the gospel. They're enemies of God, and we should ridicule them even because what they believe is ridiculous. I'm bro, sure, yeah, if you don't want to be effective at your mission, then do that all day long, right? It's been said that most people who reject Christianity, they don't do so for ideological reasons, they do it for personal reasons. And, that's not always true. There's some people who are no, it's the ideology, it's the beliefs, that's why I don't believe. And okay, then you've been offended by the offense of the gospel, not by the offense of Nick Cady being a jerk, right? So it's not about being seeker sensitive, it's about being comprehensible and kind. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's important to have an open dialogue with people that, if they disagree with you, that's okay. And to not be offended at that, and to not have to push back into that, not have an answer for everything. And I'm going to end with the last word. And it's just okay to have a good conversation with somebody who disagrees with you completely, and at the end, to be okay with it, and to have them be okay, and just have an open dialogue. I've worked with people, before I went to the ministry, where we would just have an open dialogue. I knew that if they ever had a question about my beliefs, that we could talk about it, and I always made that known to them. And sometimes I would even come with questions about their beliefs. And so when I'm curious about their beliefs, they'll be curious back, and there's an open dialogue with our beliefs. And we would get into, many people that I worked with, we would get into some great conversations. And some conversations just lasted a couple minutes, some would last hours. And in the end, they knew more about Jesus, and they were a little bit closer, and there was another seed planted. And that sometimes is the goal. The goal isn't always to, reap the harvest.
Close the deal.
Close the deal, that's right. I'm going to push it, close the deal. Sometimes the goal is to just plant that seed and keep planting them, and somebody that I may never know or meet may come along and they may harvest. But I was a part of that process, and that's all I'm.
What thing gives you most joy today?
Cheeseburgers. Oh, no, I meant Jesus. That came out loud, didn't it?
Yeah, I think, I think as I've been a Christian longer, I think that it's the longevity of things that gives me joy. The fact that I'm still married to my wife, the fact that my kids still like me, that my kids are interested in Jesus, and that actually, go to, the Apostle John. This is what gives me most joy. My children are walking in the truth. And so right now, I think I get a lot of joy from our staff interactions at church. And there were times in my life when I got the joy in ministry in the wrong ways. When it was all about numbers and being able to pat myself on the back and whatever. And I think I'm kind of over that, I think that's what happens a lot of times. They say, we all have these ideas. If I get this, then I'll be truly happy. And then you get it and you realize that it wasn't actually as good as you thought it was going to be. And then you realize that you have to find your joy in the things that really matter. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I agree completely. One of the biggest joys is family. That my family is following the Lord. I even got one kid here, so, that's an immense joy that I have. A child that wants to seek after the Lord, adds tons of joy to my life. Then, going to work, and sometimes I sit down and, I just wonder, why on earth, God, did you allow me to do this job? I love this job because I look at me and I'm going, I'm just a plain guy. There's nothing special about me. But God used me in this church, in this moment. Sometimes it's a counseling moment, or sometimes it's just, talking to somebody with their issues. And at the end, I'm like, praise the Lord that I got to be in that moment at that time. I'm not worthy of it. I have no idea why God chose me to be in that moment. But He did, and that is joyful to me. I'm not worthy to be a pastor, but for some reason He chose me, and that brings me so much joy.
What would you say the thing that tests your joy the most is today?
Yeah, personally, I think it's like the temptation to find joy in the wrong things, right? And I think that we live in a very performance-driven society, and I know that personally I'm geared in that way. Like I want to accomplish things, and I want to, check things off my list of things that I want to accomplish. And I think that the temptation there is the biggest test. The temptation it's like cotton candy. Cotton candy, when you look at it, it looks like it's going to be so big and satisfying, and then you bite into it, and it's empty, and it leaves you feeling gross. And I think that's how most things in this world are, right? Like, that are like false hopes for joy. And so I think that's the biggest thing, temptation to do those things and then just end up feeling gross.
Yeah, and also, I think there are people that are just joy sappers. They come along and they sap your joy because they're overly critical, they're not walking in the Spirit, but they think that they are. And so there are people like that in every church, and you just gotta, sometimes the people, they come into my life and they're just joy sappers. And you have to be ministering to them. And, but you also have to not let them get too far engaged into my life. You have to keep them at a distance because sometimes they want to be your best friends, and you're just like, I'm still ministering to you, so you cannot be sapping my joy. So there are people in life that come along, and they are just very overly critical, or they're focused on the wrong thing in ministry. They're focused on the politics, and they're all very upset about the politics, and they're missing the point of the ministry. And you have to minister to them and point them in the right direction. But if you let them too close into you, they'll just keep sapping that joy. They'll just pull it out of you. So you have to have a balance with that.
All right. Closing question: what one piece of advice would you give to Bible college students here, most of which don't know what they're doing after this and are waiting on the Lord?
Yeah, I think that here's the thing. You have an incredible benefit. They say that youth is wasted on the young. But that doesn't have to be true. Like, you have a lot of years ahead of you. One of the things is that I'm really cautious of now. I just turned 40. And I noticed that, man, I'm a lot more reticent to take steps of faith now because I have a lot more to lose. When I was 20 years old, I had nothing to lose because I didn't own anything, right? Like, oh, you want me to move across the world with a backpack? Yeah, sure, I'm not doing anything else, right? And it was the best decision I ever made. And so I would say, yeah, my word of advice is the same one I gave this morning. Become meaningfully engaged in the work of God. It doesn't matter where you do it, just do it. And you have that benefit of time on your side right now. Take advantage of it, And I love some of that. I heard Timothy Keller say this once. He said, the thing about the good news of the gospel is that it makes it okay to try something and fail at it. It's almost like we're like kids playing in the sandbox. And it's like you can try something, and if it fails, okay, like you didn't lose anything. And I think that's easier to do, especially when you're young. So I would encourage you guys, kind of step out in faith, get meaningfully involved in the work of God. That is going to be something you will never regret for the rest of your life.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree with that. Don't be afraid to try new things. God has amazing plans for you. Don't be afraid to step out into that. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, ask Nick. And you don't have to shake your head. So, yeah, I mean, it's okay to laugh at yourself and go, man, that was a stupid thing to do. And, but you were doing it in an attempt in ministry, and that's a good thing. Get out there, do ministry, follow the Spirit's leading, and don't be afraid to make mistakes, and don't be afraid that you might, lose an opportunity here or there. If the Lord's leading you there, He wants you there. It's okay.
Yeah, I've had friends who planted churches, and then maybe those churches then close after a few years. And they look at it and they'll say to me, "I'm a failure." I'll say, "What are you talking about, man? You obeyed the Lord, you went out, and there were some years there when you were teaching people the Bible. Like you were leading people in worship, you baptized people. Like how can you say that's a failure?" Do you ever notice that none of the churches, there's 7 letters, 7 churches in Revelation, none of those churches are still open. Okay, they all shut down. Every church has a lifespan. And I think that being so afraid of having that label put on you that you're a failure, I would say don't do that. Right? That's a trap. I remember, so I'll tell this story quickly, but I planted my first church. I was 21 years old when I planted it, and I was in Hungary. And so I planted this church, and for the first start, we were going for a couple months, and it was very hard. I remember like the low point of it all. We had 4 people come on a Sunday morning, and I was like, we had set up all these chairs, I prepared this Bible study, and I preached that Bible study, and I was like angry as I preached it. I just wanted it to be over, and I didn't even minister to the people who were in front of me. I was just like, so like upset that things weren't going better, and I remember just thinking, I'm a failure, because my identity was, I'm a missionary, and if I'm not succeeding as a missionary, then I'm a failure. And my wife told me at one point, she's like, why are you doing this? She's like, this is what you do. It isn't who you are. And that's what the benefit we have as Christians. We have an identity that is rooted in Christ and is unchanging in our circumstances. So you can try things, and if they don't work out, it doesn't mean you're a failure. It doesn't change your identity at all. Okay, you did that for a while, did some cool things, now you're going to do something else. So don't be afraid to mess up. It doesn't make you a failure. It doesn't change your identity at all. So, yeah, that'd be my advice. Get meaningfully involved in the work of God. Be willing to step out and follow Him, and use time on your side.
Yeah, I love that. Make a mistake. Learn from the mistake, though. Don't just ignore the mistake. Learn from it and move on to the next mistake. No opportunity. So.
All right, thank you. Let's give a thank you to our panelists.